So good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this session. I'm Eleanor Langford. I'm a reporter with PoliticsHome. I have a particular interest in environment policy. And I'm thrilled to be joined by a brilliant panel to be discussing securing a low-carbon future for UK homes. So with me today, I've got Dr. Whitehead, who is the Shadow Minister for Green New Deal and Energy. I've got Malcolm Farrow, who's Head of Communications at OFTEC. Peter Smith, who's Director of Policy and Research at National Energy Action, and Alexandra Griffin, who is a Dodds political consultant on energy. So we're going to have some brief introductory remarks from the participants, and then we will go into general discussion, and then at the end there will be questions. There's a Q&A box down at the bottom, and you can pop your questions in there as we go. So Malcolm, whenever you're ready, if you'd like to tell us a bit about yourself and your background on the issue.
Okay, thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. Yeah, I'm Malcolm Farrow, Head of Communications at OFTEC. For those of you that don't know, OFTEC is a trade association for the liquid fuel sector, the heating sector. And we serve around about 1.5 million homes, mainly rural homes in the UK. And that makes heating oil the most popular fuel for rural homes. As well as being a trade association, we also run a registration scheme for heating technicians that work in off-gas technologies. So again, that can be heating oil, but it can also be things like heat pumps and biomass boilers as well. We've got around about 10,000 technicians on our books at the moment. And to make sure that they're all properly trained, we've got very close working relationships with over 90 training centres right the way across the UK and Northern Ireland as well. And that's to make sure that they're able to do the work that is required to be done in people's homes and businesses, and to make sure that they provide a really good service. I'm really pleased that this is happening today. I mean, we know that decarbonisation is an absolutely vital job, and so is energy efficiency in UK homes. We've only got 30 years left to get to net zero, so we really can't afford to waste any further time on that. And up to now, we've made really good progress, mainly infrastructure type progress. And now we're going to start a much stiffer challenge, which means getting into people's homes and really changing the way that we live. And so really this is a good session to focus on that challenge, particularly in relation to heating.
Great, thank you, Malcolm. Would Peter Smith, would you like to go next? Oh, I think you're still muted.
First person to do that. I think it's always a relief for the other people on the panel when that happens to someone else first. So thanks very much, Eleanor. It's great to be taking part at Labour Conference and another Fringe event with Alan Whitehead, even if the circumstances today feel very different. And thanks very much to OFTEC and Dodds for inviting us along. NEA, like many organisations, has got strong working relationships with public sector and private sector partners that are all determined to end cold homes. We've just taken part in our Warm Homes Week, which was going to be our annual conference up in Harrogate to discuss some of these stark challenges. Obviously, the current crisis is COVID, and we know even before COVID, warm homes were a distant aspiration for millions and millions of households across the United Kingdom, and sadly over 10,000 people needlessly die each year due to living in and that's saying nothing of the acute pressure that the current crisis is putting on our already stretched health services. So our immediate focus as a charity is on addressing the impacts of COVID and its overlap between aggravating respiratory and circulatory problems, which are very, very similar to living in a cold home. We've identified several issues where we need in the short term to really improve our game, and I'm talking collectively across society in terms of supporting those people that are vulnerable to living in a cold home this winter. One of the key things is improving the identification of households, trying to improve awareness of the support that's available. I mean, it's fantastic that there's a lot of industry-led protection schemes in place for off-gas grid consumers, but it's absolutely vital that we shout at the top of our lungs and using different medium to get through that message that there is support available this winter. We know that energy debt's going to be a pressing and growing challenge. households are sadly spending a lot more time in their own homes, and that looks like it's going to continue, if not get more acute in the coming days. And we know that as a result, they're using a lot more energy, and many people can't afford that energy because they might have lost their jobs or be on decreased wages due to furlough. So we know that there's some pressing challenges that need to be confronted, and we've recently set out our UK fuel poverty monitor, which reveals just what those challenges are and some of the solutions. But we're here to talk about a much broader challenges, which is about decarbonising and decarbonising in a fair and equitable way. I think it's true to say that if we've been doing this presentation even just a year ago, we'd be talking about the fact that off-gas households are exposed to higher costs compared to gas customers. But we know that the cost of heating oil in particular has been falling as a result of the reductions in wholesale prices, but we need to make sure and that we use this sort of breathing space that we have to pull on the other lever, which is to reduce energy costs. And clearly the way that you do that is reducing needless volume of energy, and we do that through energy efficiency. Sadly, in rural homes, we've got a real challenge to do that because we're dealing with solid wall, older properties that are hard to treat. There's fewer heating technologies that are available, and there's fewer low-cost energy efficiency measures. And as a result, those households often miss out on government-led programmes that are there to support them and reduce energy costs. There's obviously wider barriers, which we'll probably come to in some of the Q&A about what can be done to address those households. For example, there's sparse and dispersed agencies there to support those households. So it's vital that we use the groups that are well known in rural communities to give them energy advice. Final thing I want to say is that NEA previously welcomed Labour's plan for Warm Homes for All scheme, the Air Energy Efficiency Programme, a very ambitious programme which was going to look to address all 27 million homes that we've got to reach if we're going to reach net zero, with a priority focus on low income and fuel poor households. We very much welcome the vision that was set out, and whilst Labour didn't win the election, you are still in power in Wales, and we would love you to implement a similar policy in Wales. Obviously, we've got the elections in Wales coming up next year, so there's an opportunity for Labour to set out some really ambitious plans looking to end fuel poverty and address needless scandal of people dying in their homes by doing a lot more on energy efficiency, particularly for rural households, for the reasons that I've described. So looking forward to hearing what everybody else has, and thanks very much for that chance to set out a few opening remarks.
Thank you very much, Peter. And on that note about Labour, we'll go to Dr. Whitehead.
Sorry, I've just done a Peter Smith there. Thanks very much, Eleanor. Indeed, as Peter has mentioned in his contribution, we put forward at the last election a comprehensive programme of basically seeking to treat all 27 million homes we've got out there one way or another to bring them up to a very high level of energy efficiency in the country. And yes, that was something we put forward. We didn't win the election on, but we certainly haven't resiled from at all now, because increasingly I think it's evident that certainly with the commitment now to net zero and the speed with which we've got to get to net zero, we've actually got to look at how housing plays a role in that in an entirely different way. That is, it's not the case, it shouldn't be the case anymore that actually we say, well, we've got a bit of a problem with energy efficiency in homes. They're not very energy efficient. People get a bit cold in their homes. Fuel poverty is very much concentrated in the less insulated homes and Ds and Es in SAP rating, and therefore we do a bit about it at that end, and that will substantially alleviate the problem. No, we've got to get everything right as far as our housing is concerned because of the climate imperative that's ahead of us. And that means that we've actually got to look at what you do in a very different way than we've done hitherto in terms of the schemes that have been in place, useful though some of them have been for energy efficiency in homes. And we've also got to, I think, fundamentally challenge the view that one way or another, people pay for the energy efficiency in their own homes through, for example, increased energy bills as a result of the levies that come back to them from the way the schemes have worked in the past. I'm quite clear that the fundamental driver for that sort of energy efficiency scheme has to be socialised among all of us. It's a public taxation issue, bearing in mind that you actually got to treat housing as a sort of massive infrastructure issue, which you would expect a large amount of public investment to go into to get right. And I think that's the way that we're actually going to ensure that that people are able to accept that as those programs go forward, that it's not going to be something that they're going to have to invest half their life savings in or accept a 20% higher electricity bill as a result. Indeed, on the contrary, they will get much more efficient homes, they will get much lower energy bills. Certainly fuel poverty will be very substantially combated as a result of that sort of large scheme. And by the way, we will have got, as a whole, an energy efficient infrastructure of homes, which, for example, would use about 30% less energy in homes in terms of heat as a result of those measures. So an enormous contribution to actually decarbonising the energy system in the process. Now, I appreciate there are lots of different aspects to this. We've talked about on-grid homes, off-grid homes, new homes, among other things. I mean, it's quite startling that actually we're still building new homes at the moment, 13% of which fall into category D or below as far as SAT rating is concerned, that we know we're going to have to be retreated over the next few years. So getting that right as far as the energy efficiency of our homes is concerned is important. As far as off-grid is concerned, well, you know, do we concentrate what we're doing off-grid into heat pumps and biofuels, and do different treatments as far as on-grid properties are concerned? Are there horses for courses in terms of energy efficiency and driving low carbon heating into the domestic sector? So that there are all sorts of questions I appreciate we've got to get right within that overall framework, but I'm absolutely clear that we've actually just got to start seeing our housing stock in a different way than we've done hitherto, in terms of how it relates to low carbon energy for the future, and indeed how it relates to achieving net zero within in the fastest time possible.
Thank you very much for that, Alan. And last but not least, we have Alexandra Griffin.
Thanks, Ellie. So as Ellie said earlier, I'm Dodds Monitoring's political consultant for energy, climate change and the built environment. So really my interest in the area comes from the fact that I serve oil and gas companies, insulators, government-sponsored bodies, and energy retailers, who I think all have a part to play in this discussion. I think when we're talking about fuel poverty, decarbonising homes and the on-grid, off-grid debate, there's kind of 4 key areas to be addressed, and those are low income, number one, energy prices, so how much does energy actually cost, how much does it cost to heat your home, energy efficiency of homes, so insulation, how much energy is actually lost, and then decarbonisation, so the climate debate. As mentioned, I think by someone previously, it's currently UK homes emit a substantial amount of emissions. I think it accounts for 14% of the UK's total emissions, which is very considerable. And obviously one of the key areas that needs to be addressed in order to meet net zero by 2050. I think the energy performance certificates and how many homes we currently have at Band C highlight just how big this issue is. The Clean Growth Strategy, although ambiguously laid out that many more homes need to reach Band C by 2035 in order to get to net zero. And currently I think we're only at about 12% of homes, and we still have some homes which are at Band E, which is so far off the mark. It's almost really difficult to see how that it can be changed in the next 15 years. As it was really interesting to Alan's point on domestic taxation, because I think part of the reason this issue has been somewhat neglected is because we don't quite know yet who's going to fit the bill for it. Is it the consumer? Is it the government? Is it developers? And similarly, what department does it fall across? So I think ultimately, for me, I think this discussion needs to be about how there's a whole government approach to this. You know, and someone mentioned Wales and Scotland earlier as well in their opening remarks, and housing has devolved, but the UK net zero target is obviously a whole UK issue. So how do we then link up between the Welsh Government, the Scottish Government and Westminster? Yeah, so those are the key points I wanted to get across.
Thank you very much for that, Alex. We'll move into some questions in just a moment, but just to sort of recap some of what we're going to be talking about, we're going to be looking at reducing emissions, posing a very unique challenge, and how off-grid properties have been identified as a very urgent government priority. And with high levels of fuel poverty, how can we ensure that these households don't pay the price for going green? So we're going to be looking at new heating technologies and policies on offer and how we can use those to reach net zero. So my first question to the panel will be, reducing carbon emissions from UK homes is a priority. So why have previous support schemes like the Green Deal and the RHI failed? And what can be done to prevent this from happening again? I don't know if Alan would like to start, or if anyone else would like to start.
The reasons for the failure of Green Deal, I think, can be pretty straightforwardly put in the category of "we told you so." I mean, I was very much involved in the 2013 Energy Act and did say at the time, this is not going to work in terms of how it is pitched. And it's interesting that the Green New Deal was a sort of market-based version of trying to securitize future income from reduced energy bills, and then use that to pay the cost of the deal up front. That would only have worked if the perceived interest rate for the money that was borrowed to make the Green Deal work was low enough for the people to consider that actually that really would work out to be a decent deal in the future. And of course, in many instances, it didn't. And having an upfront rate of about 9% or something like that meant that as far as Green Deal measures are concerned, it would have been much cheaper for most people to go down to B&Q and get the lagging and get the bloke round the corner to put it in, than actually go for a Green Deal arrangement. So it just was a misconceived way to do it, but a sort of pay-as-you-save way to go about it is not necessarily a stupid idea in its own right, because one of the things, of course, that's going to come out from, say, schemes like Labour's scheme for energy efficiency is that people's bills are going to be so much lower as a result, and they will not be then backloaded by levies making them more expensive again. So it'll be a genuine saving for people over a period of time, and I would have thought a long-term incentive for them to actually collaborate with the process that's going on. So I'm reminded of sort of area schemes where people have gone in and started to do an area up, say, with external cladding, and then one or two people have been holdouts from that. And when the neighbours start saying, hang on a minute, my bills have gone down by 60%, then people start cooperating at that point. Whereas if you had schemes which actually take that away again after you think you've got it in your pocket, I don't think that would lead to so much collaboration. Clearly, I think it's the end for Green Deal type schemes. RHI, I think there are a number of complex reasons why that didn't work so well. It did work to some extent in some areas, not in the domestic area. For example, the development of biomethane and various other things. But I think overall, I think it's been pretty disappointing. But again, interestingly, renewable heat incentive was actually not a levy. It was based on general taxation.
I wouldn't mind coming in on that point. So I think the big Alan rightly articulates many of the flaws of the Green Deal, and I won't go through that. But from a low-income fuel poverty perspective, the Green Deal signalled the end of grant funding for fuel poverty initiatives, energy efficiency. That it wound down Warmfront, which was the flagship Labour policy that was there to install comprehensive energy efficiency measures in on and off gas grid properties. In a very welcome way, the policy, Warmfront policy, also recognised the fact that you'd need a higher capital grant if you were dealing with off-gas grid homes, and a more generous capital contribution towards the cost of those energy saving measures, and that was wiped away with the Green Deal. And the only policy that was left was a supplier obligation, and that fails rural households for a few reasons. But the main one is that obligated energy suppliers that deliver that programme across Great Britain do so at least cost. And clearly, as I hope I reminded everybody in our remarks, rural properties aren't the least cost homes to focus on. So, you know, it's naturally going to cherry pick the easy stuff, and it's designed to do that. So that's probably the reason that that scheme hasn't been entirely successful. It's welcome and it should stay in place, but it needs to be introduced alongside a complementary scheme like the other UK nations have in place. The renewable heat incentive, I would slightly question the premise it's been a failure. I think that certain types of households have been able to benefit from it. The big challenge from a fuel poverty perspective is that it doesn't pay the upfront capital towards the cost of the measures. It provides an ongoing subsidy. So you've got to be able to have a conversation with your bank manager to say, I'm going to get this payment if you can give me the cash upfront, or if you're in a very fortunate position, you'll be able to pay for the renewable technology out of your own savings. But fuel poor households, given that they're living on incomes below £11,000 each year on average, aren't going to be able to do that. So therefore, it hasn't benefited them. There is some hope that the Green Home Grant is slightly different in that respect, but it's a very short, limited opportunity. And at the moment, we don't have any clarity from the current government about how long that investment is going to be sustained for.
I'd be interested in hearing from Malcolm about what you think needs to be done policy-wise by the government to rectify some of the issues that were present with the Green Deal and the RHI.
Well, I think Alan and Peter have already made a lot of really good points. I mean, the thing about the RHI is that I think it's quite regressive, because it does tend to support people who can actually afford to make that capital investment. So one of the obvious learning points there is to try and create schemes that do supply upfront funding and don't penalise people with, like the Green Deal had, with higher interest rates. That's clearly a bad thing. We also need to design schemes that are simple and straightforward to implement. I mean, one of the most shocking characteristics of the Green Deal is that for every loan arranged, it cost the taxpayer £17,000. And that's very poor value for money, and it means that as a taxpayer we're paying almost twice really for these things. Another thing that perhaps hasn't been mentioned, and I think this is one of the key things about the way these schemes are often designed, and I'm thinking of Green Deal and Eco actually, is that what tends to happen is that the way the schemes function, from an installer perspective, they're quite hard for small installer businesses to get involved with, because there's quite a lot of additional sort of hurdles you have to sort of take on board in order to be able to take part in these schemes. And what that tends to then mean is that they're really only open to larger companies that often then subcontract the installation work. And what that then does is that you've got installers rushing around trying to install as many boilers as they can, or whatever the product is, as quickly as possible. And one of the problems with that is they're not particularly accountable. They're not necessarily quite so bothered about quality because they're not likely to have any comeback. And that, I think it's far preferable for schemes to be able to be accessed by small local installers who can then operate in their own area where they've got a reputation and where they need to keep that reputation going, and to actually build the relationships with their local customer base. And that, I think that is a much better model. But I mean, I think the other sort of takeaway for me is that, you know, as the others quite rightly said, rural homes have missed out on these grant schemes. And I think, you know, given that the poor state of rural homes and the fact that the Clean Growth Strategy stated that off-grid properties are a target for the 2020s, they desperately need help, particularly in terms of insulation, and it really needs to be targeted to them.
Alex, if you have anything you want to add before we move on?
No, I think everything that needs to be said has. I would just pick up on Peter's point about how homes can't afford this. You cannot expect a home with, as Peter said, living on under £11,000 a year to be able to afford a solar heat pump or a ground heat pump, which can vary between £4,000 to £18,000. It is nuts. It's never going to work. So yeah, there needs to be a better way to tackle those off-grid living in fuel poverty.
I mean, cost is obviously a central issue with rolling out this. So how do you think a successful market can be brought forward that drives down cost for consumers? I don't know who wants to come in first on that one.
I'm happy to. Sorry, Malcolm, you go ahead if you like.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I mean, I suppose the thing I would say really is a lot of this is about friction, really, and if you make it difficult for people to take up energy efficiency measures and the cost of access is expensive, people aren't going to be able to do it. And the only way you can really tackle this is to find ways of bringing down cost and to make the measures more affordable and more straightforward to install. I mean, disruption is another major hurdle that often puts consumers off. And you know, these points were made really most recently by the UK Citizen Climate Assembly, which really talked about how important it was that people had choice. So, you know, I think you really got to increase competition, and that means you know, that will increase innovation. And I think those sort of things are really important. And up to now, the government has tended to take an approach where they've tried to sort of cherry pick the best technologies, whether it's heat pumps or biomass or whatever it might be. And they've tended to shut out technologies they're less certain about. And what I'd like to see is policy that really sets a target, you know, an emission target, but then is more technology neutral and supportive of all potential technologies, really, to allow a sort of level playing field that basically encourages sort of other things like biofuel people we're interested in to get involved, really, because I think that provides more choice and ultimately that will make for a better marketplace.
I think also we've got to get ourselves into different habits of what it is we value, what we're putting into homes, and what savings result, and what that means overall for the position of the householder and the thing in the household and the good of society as a whole. I mean, Malcolm, I think, made what I thought was a really interesting point about the Green Deal, which was, as it happened, we could have just given £17,000 to each householder and said, go and sort your house out, and we'd have saved money on the schemes. But we didn't look at it like that. And that's what I think is really important in actually starting to say, right, regardless of whether a particular householder gets an advantage in the value of their property or you know, they've got something that someone else hasn't got, every household that is made more energy efficient or substantially more energy efficient is a public good gain, if you like. And that's what I think we need to start from, understanding this. That doesn't mean that people who can pay don't pay necessarily. It doesn't mean that we don't have schemes which actually invite a partnership in terms of how those houses are improved. But it does mean that the fundamental underpinning is it is a good thing, not just for you, that your house is being uprated, and you should expect a public contribution to that process whilst it happens. And there are all sorts of things around that which can be additional bonuses. And I mentioned already, the astonishing changes in energy bills when, say, particularly Malcolm, you mentioned rural homes. I mean, the leakiness of rural homes, and not only are you paying quite often for the leakiness of the homes, but you're also paying for technologies which are much more expensive to underwrite in terms of fuel costs and so on than you would in other environments. And so making that tremendous change, 60–70% in reduction in bills in certain areas, is itself, I think, a tremendous gain for the public good, and obviously for the people in those households. And you shouldn't, I think, seek to take that away again from them because they've gained that change in their energy bills. It's a good thing. It's fighting fuel poverty. It's making a big dent in carbon emissions. It's making homes fit for the future so you don't have to do it again. All those gains as a result of what in the end is actually not a desperate amount of public investment. I mean, the figures sound quite big, but compared with some of the stuff we've been doing just for the last 3 months, say, for example, it's a drop in the ocean.
I would just echo Alan's point about this being a public investment. When you fully monetize the benefits, it's very clear that, particularly if you're dealing with tackling fuel poverty and the beneficiaries of those measures of fuel poor households or low income and vulnerable households that are at acute risk of things like respiratory disease, then there's a huge public saving if you prepare to invest that pound up front. So that's absolutely essential. I'd also caution against the idea that you can see a lot of cost reduction in the energy efficiency sector. There is most of the technologies that we would need to use to get to net zero are here and now. They've been around for quite a long time. Despite the fact that their adoption on continent is more strong, the capital cost of the kit, i.e. the production of the unit to install, isn't going to change a huge amount, and neither's the labour cost. Particularly the labour cost shouldn't be artificially screwed down, because that can lead to poor technical standards, and we don't want to have a race to the bottom in terms of the quality of installation at the same time. So whilst there can be some cost transformation, and you look at offshore wind, for example, and you note the huge reductions there isn't massive amounts, but I think identifying those opportunities that Alan's identified for area-based schemes where we do see the potential to reduce costs on a street-by-street basis compared to sort of pepper potting, those opportunities do exist, but they shouldn't be overhyped, I guess.
Thank you, Peter.
Just to come in there as well, I think in terms of market solutions, I think to enable us to get to the right solutions, we actually need a mix of kind of public policy experts working alongside private companies. I think it's all well and good to hear it from one side or the other, but actually in order to put solutions in place to reduce costs and ensure that the policy is sustainable long term, we do need to hear the sides of both areas. So I think last week, for example, the Green Finance Institute launched a zero carbon heating task force to literally look at the way private investment can fund zero carbon heating in the long term. And I think that's exactly the kind of things that should be looked at and encouraged in order to find the solutions to this problem.
Great, thank you, Alex. Excellent points there. A lot of discussion of the challenges of improving off-grid households and rural homes. And I know that they were described quite often as a low-hanging fruit, so very easy to implement. Do you agree with that analysis? Malcolm, if you want to start.
This could be the quickest answer of the night, really, if I just say no. But I'll try and expand on that a little bit, really. I mean, while we don't think that off-grid homes are an easy option at all, I do sometimes wonder if the government's own policy advisors agree, really. I think there seems to be a view that they are an ideally sort of bite-sized chunk to sort of practice on, and I find that rather worrying. And the policy ideas around putting heat pumps, which is what the Committee for Climate Change advocate, yes, you could do it, but it would be fabulously expensive. So, and I think it's important to look at the reasons why. I mean, if you take oil heated homes, which is obviously the group I'm most familiar with, only 3% are currently in EPC bands A to C, while something like 65% are in the really poorest efficiency bands of E to G. And it's commonly assumed that that's down to high fuel prices, but as Peter mentioned, oil is currently quite cheap and has, in the last 4 or 5 years, has been broadly comparable to gas. So it really is more to do with the fabric of those buildings and the fact that they are very poorly insulated. As a group, they're not homogenous at all. They're not like a row of similar houses that you would see in an urban street. You go to a village out in the countryside and virtually every home can be different. It could be built at a different time, often sort of 50, hundreds of years apart even, built of different things. It's a much more tricky challenge. And you also have to think about the people that live in those homes. You've got people who tend to be on lower incomes with higher outgoings. So they've got much less money to spend on those homes. And that again creates a further challenge, really, that you've got an expensive house to retrofit and you've got the people living in it who haven't necessarily got the funds. So I think it's that, those two things are very difficult. And I think another problem I'd probably throw into the mix, particularly in terms of the idea of putting electric heating into these households, is that that's going to have quite a lot of an impact on the electric grid. And we know National Grid is concerned about that because in their current future energy scenarios publication, they've basically identified that it could be as many as 1 million off-grid homes aren't going to be suitable to be upgraded cost effectively because the grid's going to be too expensive to do. And they are currently looking at biofuels again as the solution for that. And obviously working in the liquid fuel heating sector, you'd think I would say that. And I don't necessarily think all existing oil heated homes should carry on being heated by oil. I think it's really going to depend on a cost effectiveness sort of analysis, really. And I think if you live in a home that's already well insulated, then yeah, great. I think it would be good to put a heat pump in. But for these older properties, I definitely think other solutions are going to be better.
I think that does create a challenge. Sorry, Eleanor. I think that does create a challenge to Labour's previously stated policy. I think one of the additional barriers of working in rural areas is the lack of support agencies compared to more urban areas, where you're more likely to have a sort of a tooled up local authority or agencies that can come and deliver this stuff at scale and really know their stuff. I'm not saying that they don't exist in rural areas, but they're fewer and further between, and therefore, whilst, as I've mentioned, we really support Labour's overall concept, the idea of an area-based energy efficiency rollout doesn't really work in a rural setting unless it's got some sort of bespoke parameters around, particularly targeting smaller hamlets, isolated villages, that sort of kind of precision in terms of its focus. So we would argue that it should also have a sort of a self-referral type scheme alongside it, that you'd have the street-by-street rollout that would be working with local authorities, but you would have a sort of self-referral scheme sitting alongside the sort of national coordinated local authority-led programme that would enable those isolated rural areas to also benefit, a bit like, as I mentioned previously, the old Warm Front off-gas grid grant provided access to.
Yeah, I would largely agree with that, and I hope that, Peter, you didn't think that our area-based homes policy was one which would be sort of rolled out like a load of tanks over the entire countryside without any consideration for the particular circumstances that we're in. And I think from discussions we've had previously that the whole question of what you do about heat decarbonisation in homes is not susceptible to the idea that you electrify everything or I mean, it's interesting. We got a bit of a swing of the pendulum now. There are a number of people now saying, well, we hydrogenise everything now instead of electrify everything. And the truth of the matter is, actually, you've got to do a lot of different things in different places to deal with different situations. So certainly, district heating is very relevant in dense urban areas, but probably not in rural areas. Although, having said that, I was in Denmark a little while ago, and I went to see a district heated village where the heat is supplied by straw from the farms around. It's very accountable because there's a bloke who runs it. I don't say this in a particularly sexist way. It is a bloke who runs it. And if anything goes wrong, they just knock on his door and say, hey, my heating's not working very well. So it can be done, but I would accept that it's clearly not the sort of thing you can prescribe on a basis. I mean, I also went up the top of a Welsh hill a little while ago and looked at hybrid heat pumps. That's a sort of good potential interesting solution for some off-grid homes. And in any event, as you said, Malcolm, the general lack of good insulation in a lot of instances in terms of rural housing, it's very difficult to insulate it even to a level where a heat pump can work reasonably well in terms of the background heating that goes into it. So you really can't prescribe area by or zone by zone exactly what you're going to do. And I think it's got to be much more horses for courses, and with a clear understanding of the goal is actually to get the best combination in any home of efficiency within the home and the best heating solution which goes along with that efficiency in the house overall. In some instances those will be bespoke solutions, in other instances there'll be area solutions, but you shouldn't impose something where it's inappropriate.
Right, thank you, Alan. Sort of following on from that point, you mentioned lots of different options there for helping homes. I'm sort of wondering what everyone thinks of how you can best support the transition to net zero for these homes. Is there one particular policy that should be pushed, or do you think it's more about creating a competitive marketplace to drive down costs? Anyone can come in.
Well, I think it's a mixture of both. I think, as Alan said, there's no one prescribed way you can approach this. Some households will need better insulation, some will need retrofitting boilers. It's going to depend where they are. It's going to depend in the state of the house. But I think the way that you support them is, especially the fuel port, is through grants. There's no other way to tackle it. And at the moment, what we've got the Green Homes Grant, which is only meant to be going, I think, till March of next year, which needs to be extended if it's going to actually make a dent in the issue. But also the Conservative Manifesto pledged to the Home Upgrades Grant as well, which we still haven't heard anything about. I don't think it's actually meant to be rolled out until 2022. So clearly, picking up on the point on whether or not it's easy to tackle this, no, otherwise they would be doing it. And part of the issue is that there isn't actually a coherent strategy yet on how to approach this. They keep rolling out new grant scheme after new grant scheme, and then, after a few months or 2 years, they scrap them, which not only leaves those who have committed to the scheme in the lurch, but also then it really doesn't create a coherent direction for how to tackle this issue. So yeah, of course we can support the fuel port, but unfortunately it's expensive to do so, which is exactly why it hasn't been done thus far.
Peter, I saw you nodding along very enthusiastically there.
Until the last bit. So I completely agree with the need for ongoing investment. Fuel poor households will need upfront capital grants to do that over a long period of time, so you can get various support agencies to row in around that and support them through that, what can be a very complicated process. It is expensive, but I just those benefits that Alan talked about, and the fact that overall countries that invest heavily in energy efficiency or have already made very strong returns, either directly back to Treasury or their treasuries through VAT on products, or the uplifts that you see in a more buoyant energy efficiency industry, or through avoided costs, either through distribution and transmission, the lack of needing to incentivize other forms of low carbon generation. A whole range of stuff makes, and obviously we talked about the health savings. So it looks like it's expensive. It's not, if you consider those wider benefits.
I do very much agree, Alexandra, with the idea that this has actually got to be something which has got some settled boundaries within it over a period of time. And we've been bedeviled in recent years by stop-start schemes, which have started a bit, and then, Green Deal, for example, a whole lot of people got themselves qualified as assessors and various other things, and found that they completely wasted their time and money in many instances. The grants that we've got in front of us right now, they're supposed to be for a year. They're supposed to spend £2 billion. They're not even coming in place till this month or next month, and they've all got to be spent by next March. The idea that you're going to do anything serious with that in that period of time, let alone the fact that you're probably not going to get even a fraction of that alleged £2 billion out of the door during that period, means that it's going to scratch the surface, whereas a better and longer term planned undertaking could have gained so much more in the process. So watchword number one has to be put these things in place and stick with them, I would say, for at least 10 years before you actually change how it works, because otherwise we're just going to get the same sort of going around the houses. And again, as Malcolm has mentioned, eco we had when it came to the reckoning period. People were rushing to nail boilers to the wall like they were going out of fashion, and then a lot of people got laid off subsequently when the next phase of eco came in, and then they started again, and different ways of trying to spend the money depending on who it was supposed to be targeted for. That really is not a way to go forward for the sort of long-term returns that Peter's envisaged for the sector overall.
I would agree with a lot of the points that have been made, actually. One thing I would say is that it's absolutely obvious that the overriding thing that we need to do first is insulate, and there's absolutely no reason why we couldn't pour much more resource into that straight away. Since 2012, insulation measures have really fallen off a cliff, and we've absolutely got to do something about that now. I think that it gets a little bit more difficult when you start talking about the actual heat technologies themselves, because while I think subsidy is really valuable and important, it also has a distorting effect on the marketplace. And we've seen since the RHI came in that actually the products supported by the RHI have increased in cost over and above the rate of inflation. Now that's obviously not ideal for consumers, and we don't want to see that. But I think some subsidies are inevitable. I'd like to see a scrappage scheme to encourage older boilers to be replaced. Whatever technology is coming in, it's got to be a good thing to put in something more efficient. I think that sort of thing is vital. I'd like to see a bit more creativity in terms of the tax regime too. So, for example, if you're using a fuel like a biofuel, that perhaps should have no VAT on it, which would, I think, help to alleviate any differences in cost between the older sort of fossil fuel and the newer biofuel, which I think, often, I don't think we get something for nothing in these sort of situations. And, if you're switching to a fuel where there's been a lot of upfront investment cost, it's likely to be more expensive. So I think you have to expect that somehow or other you know, those costs have to be offset somehow, and I think reducing the VAT rate would certainly help.
Very interesting talking about lowering costs. How do you think specifically we could help stopping a lot of these changes having a very regressive impact on lower income households? I know we've mentioned that a lot in this discussion, the upfront costs of a lot of these things. So how do you think we can, in a policy perspective, ensure that they are not hit hardest?
I'm happy to go first. This is very close to my heart, this topic. It's really important that we maintain the current progressive levies that are on consumer bills to support low income and vulnerable households. We've got a warm home discount, which provides the poorest pensioners with an automatic rebate each year off their energy bills. And it's vital that that scheme continues and is expanded to help the poorest households heat their homes. In a similar sort of way, the energy company obligation, whilst it does have some very clear flaws and the scheme could be improved a huge amount, it does currently target low income and vulnerable consumers as the prime beneficiaries, and therefore it's a more progressive form of levy than other regressive practices, particularly providing the most regressive forms of levy are providing exemptions for energy intensive users from the cost of any decarbonisation and getting domestic customers, particularly the poorest households, to pay for it. We're also very concerned that, as Alan mentioned, the renewable heat incentive is currently paid for out of general taxation, although the beneficiary, it's not progressive because the beneficiaries of those households haven't been low income and vulnerable households. It isn't regressive in the form that it doesn't, the costs of the scheme are borne by lower income households disproportionately. And there is some talk about moving away from that approach and replacing the RHI with something called a green gas levy. And I think people should see that for what it is, and it's going to be a gas tax. And if it comes in place at the wrong time, then I think that we could see some significant protest equivalent to those that we've seen in France with the old Gilets jaunes. So I think do that at your peril if you're central government, particularly at the moment, given affordability is such a stark issue due to COVID.
Yeah, I'd agree with that we simply can't continue with levies which quite often hit the poorest. Sort of round the back, you think you've done something good for low-income households, and actually it's all the money is sort of creeping back round the back, whereby that low-income household gets to pay much more than they thought in the first place, and that's just not a question of our bills are a bit higher than they might otherwise be. And as Peter has said, there are some disproportionate effects from levy systems on low-income households, and we didn't even design a levy system which would actually start to take that out. So I'm pretty clear that yes, there are some things you can do with as it were, socialising the cost across the whole of the market, and the warm homes discount is one of those. I mean, we know we've got things in the market again that Peter mentioned, such as, it is not generally known that energy-intensive users, I think, that are excused 85% of their levies, and doesn't go nowhere. It all goes on our bills, and again, that is a particular imposition that hurts fuel-poor households the most. So we've got to get out of that way of designing it pretty quickly. And make sure that where an outcome is achieved, where a bill is reduced and the living circumstances of particularly those lower income people are ameliorated as a result, it stays ameliorated afterwards and doesn't come back to hit you around the back of the head.
And Malcolm or Alex, do you have anything you wanted to add?
Yeah, well, only a couple of things. I mean, I think a lot of good suggestions have already come forward. I'm afraid, I mean, obviously off-grid is my area of interest particularly, and you'll have to excuse me if I do a blatant plug now for my industry. Biofuels are a bit of a sort of poor relation in the sort of low carbon terms, and the big advantage of them for off-grid homes is that you can install, you basically can use the biofuel in the heating system that's already there. You don't need to upgrade the boiler, although it's obviously desirable to put in the most efficient one you can. And you can use them in a house that isn't as well insulated as it could be. It's not so much of a prerequisite as it is for other technologies like heat pumps. So we would really like to see more support to help develop the UK's biofuel production capability, and I think that would really help to bring down prices, and with the right policy measures in place to support this kind of thing, I think it would be a really great solution for off-grid homes, because it does bring down the capital cost massively, and it could really push forward those homes towards a low carbon future. And you'll have to excuse me for being so blatant about that message, really.
Great, thank you. Alex, do you have anything to add?
Not specific, I'm conscious of time as well, but I think also in terms of just reducing costs overall for everyone, not just the fuel poor, you need to increase choice. So we have to support companies who currently aren't climate friendly, as it were, into making that transition, so that really the market becomes filled with the right choice. At the moment, costs are high because there aren't many, I don't know, fitters or suppliers that people can turn to. So we need to increase choice, but we need to make sure that we don't leave behind the industries in the move to that.
Great, thank you. If the panel's happy to go ahead, I know we're short on time. We've got one or two questions I think would fit in quite interestingly. One is from Adam, and it's asking about energy performance certificates, suggesting that they are not fit and they should be reformed. Does the panel have any thoughts on that?
Well, Adam's substantially right. I mean, they actually don't do a very good job in terms of what we think they are doing about measuring what is the real overall energy performance of a home. And what slightly worries me sometimes is that actually we talk about band B and band C and band D properties, and these are based on a slightly flawed methodology of actually measuring outputs against inputs as far as houses are concerned, which could actually be substantially reformed and get you a much more accurate way of deciding just how energy efficient the home really is. And indeed, at the moment, you sometimes get perverse outcomes where if you change the relationship between the outputs and the inputs in homes in a way that actually goes against how the energy performance certificate is measuring the home, a home which would, by common sense, look much more energy efficient actually goes down a band. So, yeah, it's not as good as it should be. At the moment, it's pretty much all we've got to guide us in terms of how we can overall get the standards of properties up. But I would like to see some work on that methodology and getting that better for the future.
I think that's definitely right. There are improvements to the methodology that can be made. There's also improvements, and I hope I don't get a bag full of mail. There are improvements to the quality of assessors. And increasingly, local authorities are relying on deemed EPCs as well, and we know that the quality of those deemed EPCs is pretty dodgy as well. But don't throw the baby out with the bathwater is the main thing I'd like to say. A lot of really good policy is based on EPCs, and it's important that those aspirations aren't thrown out if there are, improvements that can be made to the way that it's calculated. EPCs are calculated.
One other question very quickly. I think Malcolm touched on it very briefly, but would you support removing VAT from all domestic microgeneration products? So making zero carbon, zero VAT.
I think it's easy to sign up to. Why stop at microgeneration? There's been a compelling lobby around this from a wider energy efficiency measures perspective. The only thing is, given that a big push on energy efficiency is unattractive to the Treasury because they're losing a lot of through reduced consumption of fuels, you don't want to reduce the only incentive that there is for them to flog insulation or get insulation away at the same time. So absolutely agree at a high level, but it shouldn't dampen Treasury's enthusiasm for a massive energy efficiency rollout.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I would agree as a method of really pushing this forward, but we are actually going to have a much wider reckoning on all this as we move to a much lower carbon economy. All sorts of what looked like buoyant taxes before for Treasury's purposes are going to be put in question. You know, I mean, my electric car at the moment pays no road tax. But then when everyone else has got an electric car, there'll be no road tax levied. So well, where do we go there? So I do think we need to look at how we levy taxes on various things, both as a reasonably short-term method of, as it were, getting a good outcome and preventing a bad outcome, but also look at where we've arrived once we've got through those things and how we then levy taxes, because we are going to have to levy taxes, I'm afraid, for future long-term purposes.
If anyone else had any final points on that note? Okay, well, I think that is us done. I'd like to thank you all for coming. It's been really interesting to hear your points, and thank you to all of our attendees for tuning in and asking such brilliant questions. We've got quite a few other events coming up on our DODS programme, so do check those out. And yeah, thank you and have a good evening, and good evening to all my panelists.